Hi, welcome to the National Critics' Choice Online News, and today we have a very special guest here in Singapore, and it's none other than Mrs. Joanna Wong. She's actually one of the pioneers in Singapore's opera scene, and she's going to share with us more the history as well as her latest book that she's just released, Joanna Wong, in Domino Life, an operatic legacy. And so, Mrs. Joanna Wong, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Robin.
You know, many people around the world, including in the United States, are wondering what is Chinese opera, and how is it that Chinese opera exists in the Republic of Singapore? You know, how did it all begin, and what drives you?
Well, Chinese opera, by the very name, therefore it is opera, and therefore there will be music, singing, and it is all done in Chinese. And it's a traditional art that came from China and came all the way from China to Singapore more than 160 years ago, when there were lots of immigrants from China who moved down to Singapore and Malaya to reside here. And when the Chinese immigrants came here and resided in Singapore, naturally they brought with them their art, and that was Chinese opera. And it has stayed in Singapore for more than 160 years, I'm sure. And Chinese opera, therefore, would be sung in Chinese. And in China, there are lots of dialects. China is a very big country with more than 360 dialects. So Chinese opera is a dialect opera. And when we perform Chinese opera in Singapore, we also perform in dialects. But Singapore is a small country, and therefore we don't have 360 dialects. We only have a handful of dialects. And the more popular Chinese opera in Singapore are Cantonese opera, sung in the Cantonese dialect, Teochew opera, sung in the Teochew dialect, which we now call Chaozhou dialect, and Fujian opera, sung in the Fujian dialect or the Hokkien dialect. Then also the Hainanese opera, sung in the Hainanese dialect. So we only have a few dialect operas in Singapore. It's a traditional art form that lives still in Singapore because Singapore is a multi-racial, multicultural country, and therefore traditional art still prevails in Singapore. And a lot of amateur opera artists in Singapore. Unfortunately, the professional opera artists, Chinese opera artists, are a dying breed because most of them find that it's not easy to make a living being a professional Chinese opera artist. And they don't encourage their children to take up the art. So there are less and less professional Chinese opera artists in Singapore, but a lot of amateur enthusiasts who perform Chinese opera as their hobbies, as their interests. And I'm one of those with a lot of passion for Chinese opera from a very tender age. When I was a little kid, I was even 2 or 3 years old, I was brought to Chinese opera by my aunt. And if you read my book, you understand that during when I was a baby, that was the Japanese occupation time in Malaya and Singapore, and I was a baby in arms. I was brought to Chinese opera, and I grew up watching Chinese opera. So my love for Chinese opera stemmed from that time. And when I became a teenager, I started learning Chinese opera the very hard way because there were no teachers, no proper teachers of Chinese opera. So I learned by watching Chinese opera on stage, watching Chinese opera films, and listening to records. In those days, they were records, no DVDs and no CDs. And through that means, I grew to love Chinese opera more and more.
Now, you said that you have loved Chinese opera all your life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what was the one thing that motivated you, that inspired you, and even inspire you to be a Chinese opera actor?
As I said, from a tender age, I already started liking Chinese opera. First, I was attracted by the beautiful costumes, the glittering costumes that the actors wore on stage. Mm-hmm. And when I was a little kid, I said, well, if I grow up, I'd like to wear those beautiful costumes. You know, I'd like to be like the actors on the stage. And so when I was a teenager, I started to learn Chinese opera because of my love for Chinese opera from that tender age. And then in the university, I came to Singapore to study in the University of Singapore at that time. I met my husband, Leslie Wong, and he too also liked Chinese opera. And in the whole university with several thousand students, we were the only two, I think we were the only two who liked Chinese opera and who went to watch Chinese opera together. And because of that, the growing interest between the two of us, we continued to promote Chinese opera after our marriage.
How important Chinese opera is for Singapore, and as well as to a Chinese, for Chinese in Singapore. Do you think Chinese opera should be preserved as a heritage?
I definitely think that Chinese opera should be preserved. It is an art form that is rich in culture with more than 1,000 years of history. And Singapore being a multicultural, multiracial society, we should continue to promote the arts of our different races, like the Malay arts and the Indian dances, Indian art, Indian music, Chinese, and so on. And Chinese opera also, besides being a very rich art form, it also teaches a lot of good values, Chinese values like filial piety, loyalty, chastity, and things like that, in the stories that we have. And also Chinese opera, a lot of the stories are historical. So in it, people also would be able to learn a bit about Chinese history. So it should be preserved as a good art form.
And moving forward, you have actually faced poverty in life while you were crafting the art of opera. Were there any mentors earlier on, or you actually had to learn all the art forms from stage?
In the early days when I was a teenager in the 1950s and early 1960s, there weren't good Chinese opera teachers in Singapore and Malaya. They were all performers. They could perform, but they couldn't really teach properly. So I had to learn it the hard way by watching, by trying to imbibe what I've watched over the stage performances and the films, and listening to the records. Then it was only much, much later, in the late 1960s, that I was able to meet some good teachers who came from Hong Kong, and they were able to teach me various artistic values of Chinese opera and the performance movements and things, gestures and movements.
And now these gestures and movements today, do they apply in our today's 21st century that you spoke of? Have you actually improvised, to adapt what is the Chinese culture that has been evolved?
Well, basically you've got to learn the basics of the art, the movements, the gestures. Just like in ballet, you have to train properly how to stand, how to pose, how to lift your legs and things like that, right? So Chinese opera is the same. These basic artistic movements, you've got to learn. Then as you perform, as you act more and more, you learn more about the art. You can improvise, you can improve on it. In fact, learning the art is a continuous process. You cannot say, I've learned everything and that's it, full stop. I don't need to learn anymore. For artistic performances, you've got to continue to learn. And there are new things for you to learn. And you've got to open up your eyes and watch. For me, I don't just concentrate on Chinese opera. I do watch a lot of Western shows, musicals, operas, ballet, even ice skating, any art form. You learn and you're able to learn from the different art forms, certain values, certain things that you may be able to add on to your Chinese opera performances.
Now, you are an educated individual, you and your husband, from the University of Singapore. Do you face any challenges among your peers when you first entered into Chinese opera and you found that you're probably the only educated person, and do they feel threatened by your educational status? And did anyone actually question your passion? Why do you enter the life of an opera actor rather than pursuing probably life as a banker or accountant and so on?
Well, I have a career. I was a university administrator. I worked in the university for 38 long years. And after my retirement in 2001, they continued to employ me on a part-time basis as a consultant for 1.5 years. So I stayed in my working life 39.5 years at the university. Originally the University of Singapore, then I moved to Nanyang University for a couple of years, and then I continued to work in the National University of Singapore. So my career was as a university administrator, which was a very interesting life because I met a lot of students. Of course, I was in charge of student matters, student affairs. From the time the student applied for admission till the time the students graduate from the university. So that was my life, full-time university administrator. And my hobby was Chinese opera, which I spent all my time after office hours, most of the time, doing Chinese opera, learning, teaching, and so on. And there's a third part of my life, which is the family life. I have to keep a lot of time to the family, looking after my 2 daughters and my husband and the house. So the 3 parts, and I had to sort of divide my time properly in order to do the 3 bits
What is
successfully.
what is life like in Singapore during the 1950s and moving forward in the Chinese opera scene? Is it evolving to a different prospect where Chinese opera now is seen as only for the rich and the educated?
Well, Chinese opera in the 1950s, or even earlier, in fact, before the Second World War, Chinese opera was very prevalent in Singapore and Malaya.
So to the masses.
And
yes.
yeah, because in those days there were the amusement parks, if you remember, the Great World Amusement Park, New World Amusement Park, Happy World Amusement Park. And in the amusement parks there were theatres, not beautiful theatres, not air-conditioned, but proper theatres for Chinese opera performances every day of the week, and matinees on Sunday. So then came 1960s, and in the mid-1960s, when television came on, then there was a downtrend for Chinese opera because television was new and everybody stayed at home to watch television. And also at that time, Chinese opera, the performances were not of very high standard. They were mainly street operas or in the amusement parks. So people also found that it was cheaper to watch a film than to watch a Chinese opera stage performance. And also the performances were very lengthy, more than 3 hours. So some people felt, well, you could watch Chinese opera films with famous stars from Hong Kong. For 65 cents, you get a second-class ticket in the cinema, and less than 1.5 hours, you could finish the whole opera. So people stayed away from opera for a while. So there was a downward trend in the mid-1960s. And then when I came forward in 1968 to perform in Singapore, my first performance in Singapore was 1968, and I did Madame Whitesnake. And together with my group of enthusiasts, we made the opera more modernized in the sense that there were beautiful sets, and the soldiers were all wearing proper costumes, uniform type of costumes. Because at one time for Chinese opera, you could have 4 soldiers all wearing different types of costumes. It didn't match at all, And then the stage, we had proper sets, beautiful sets. And Then when I first performed the opera, it was quite an impact in Singapore, and people felt that, well, Chinese opera is not just slipshod type of performances, it's proper, serious type of performance. And then after that, more and more people came back to watch the opera. And then there was a sort of a sway more towards people coming. And in those days, there was this National Theatre at Clemenceau Avenue, which was a 3,004-seater, a very huge theatre. And when I performed there every year under the Gongzhou Huiguan, it was full house. You could pack the theatre with 3,004 audience. That was a very, very good time. And then later on, there was again a sliding downward trend, and people term Chinese opera as dying art because audience dwindled. Because a lot of people moved away from the central part of Singapore and moved away into more in those days considered more outlying areas like Ang Mo Kio, Toa Payoh, and the older folks felt that they couldn't make a trip downtown to watch opera. It was quite an effort to move downtown. They've got to dress properly, they've got to spend money having their dinner, spend money taking taxi home, and most of them stayed home to watch television. So the audience dwindled in number in the late 70s. Then fortunately in the 80s, when China opened up and a lot of troops from China came to Singapore and brought with them a very high standard of Chinese opera art, audience came back. So it was like ups and downs, downward trend, upward trend, and so on. And karaoke came in. Now karaoke is a factor that helped Chinese opera. There are lots of karaoke Chinese opera discs. And when people started listening to the karaoke, started learning to sing karaoke, then a lot of people got interested in Chinese opera, in the songs. First they started to learn how to sing, then later they wanted to perform. So nowadays we have lots of groups performing Chinese opera, all through learning how to sing through karaoke. And they are all in the community clubs, community centers, lots of them all over Singapore.
And it still exists today?
It's still existing today. So in karaoke then played a part in the promotion of Chinese opera. But unfortunately nowadays, if you look at the Chinese opera audience, every performance you could easily get 500 to 600 people, 400, 500, 600 people. And in a theatre that could accommodate 1,000, it's like a half-empty theatre. It's unfortunate. In the 60s, you could pack the theatre, in the late 60s, full house, 1,000 seats all taken up. And I said in the old National Theatre, 3,004 seats all taken up. But nowadays, mostly you could get 500 to 600 people watching. The reason being the older folks, they either cannot sit so long to watch an opera, cannot make the effort to come downtown to watch the opera, or some are too old, too frail, and some have passed away. And we don't have the next generation of younger audience taking over. So on my part, I tried a lot to get the younger people to come. Now, working in the university, I met a lot of youngsters, a lot of youths, and I always asked them, well, do you ever watch Chinese opera? They said, no. My grandfather, my grandmother, but not me. And then you ask, why don't you watch? And they gave me 3 reasons. One, very noisy. The drums and the gongs, ching, ching, chang, chang, they call it, very noisy. Secondly, too long. The opera lasts for 3-4 hours, too long, boring, can be boring. And thirdly, don't understand the language because it's sung in dialect. So I had to tackle these 3 problem areas. First, if the opera is too long, you shorten it, tighten everything. From a 3-hour performance or 4-hour performance, tighten it to 2.5 hours. You cannot shorten it anymore because there's a lot of singing, and when you sing, the pace is a bit slow. So naturally, you need a bit more time. Unlike plays, it's just a dialogue. Plays you can finish a play in 1.5 hours, or sometimes even less, or not more than 2 hours. So we can shorten the opera. And the second problem of the noise, the drums and the gongs being very noisy. I used to speak to the youths and say, well, you go to a disco, it's very noisy too, right? The drums go boom, 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 boom. And I said, when I walk into a disco, within 5 minutes, I get a headache. So it all depends whether you get used to that type of sound. So in order to tackle that problem, you try to cut down on the percussion, the drums and the gongs, try to cut down as much as possible. But Chinese opera, especially if you're fighting scenes, you need the drums and the gongs to build up that atmosphere. And the third problem of not understanding the opera, not understanding the language. Well, first you have the synopsis in both Chinese and English. Having read the synopsis, you would understand what the storyline was. Secondly, I started using Chinese and English subtitles. If you don't understand, you just watch the subtitles. Like a lot of Chinese who don't understand English, they go and watch English films, American films. The subtitles on the film, they could appreciate easily. So for Chinese opera, I started using subtitles as early as 1976. And I'm very glad that nowadays, in most of the opera performances in Singapore by either opera groups or community clubs, they also used subtitles. Some use both Chinese and English, some use just Chinese. The idea of using English subtitles is to get the English educated, the younger audience or all English educated, to come to the opera. So with this means, we hope to be able to get younger people getting interested in the opera, but it is an uphill climb. It is very difficult, not easy. Since 1976 up to now, the increase in the younger audience has not been very encouraging.
Mrs. Joanna Wong, please tell us, what are the key elements of the next step that your organization is going to try to encourage the young people to be more aware and even take part of Chinese opera here in Singapore? What are the steps that your organization is going to do in the next 5 years?
I think the next step is not strictly by my own organization, which is the Chinese Theatre Circle. It has to be people interested in Chinese opera in Singapore, everybody trying to do his best. And recently, some friends of mine, we've started a group called Preservation of Chinese Opera. We've just had a first meeting, and we're trying to tackle this problem, see how to promote Chinese opera amongst the younger people. All along, my group, the Chinese Theatre Circle, and myself, we've been giving a lot of talks. In Singapore, there's this arts education program, which is done by the National Arts Council together with the Ministry of Education. And groups, arts groups like us, we go to schools to give talks, demonstrations. Now, this is only skimming the surface. When you go to a school with 400 to 800 students seated in the big hall, listening to your half-hour talk, seeing a short opera excerpt, it doesn't help very much. It's only skimming the surface. It's only an introduction to Chinese opera. Amongst the 800 students who watched, how many would say, yes, if there's a Chinese opera performance, I would like to go to watch? Very discouraging. Not many. Because they have to be continuously given the information, given the talks, given the introduction, given how to appreciate Chinese opera, letting them know more about Chinese opera, then only will they be interested. Like me, I was brought from a very tender age to see Chinese opera every week, and that got into my head and got into me, see? So if you just, in your primary school, you just watch this arts education program once, it goes into the left ear and comes out the right ear, and that's all. You can't remember. So this sort of thing, it has to be continuous. So we are very happy to give talks to students. The moment they are interested, we will give them talks. And even to groups, we will go and give talks.
What
What
is good opera to you, in your own perspective? And Do you actually have to exercise your voice, and how long does it take to develop a good voice in opera?
Yeah. For opera, the most important thing is singing, because you spend a lot of time singing in the opera. So a good voice is important. And very often it's inborn. Some people just don't have the voice. Some people don't have the ear to get to hit the right note. So if you don't have that, it will be very difficult. So the first thing when anyone wants to learn opera, they've got to learn to sing and how to project the voice, how to pronounce the words and get the right note, the right pitch, and the timing, proper timing for everything. Then they have to learn gestures and movements, which is very important in Chinese opera. The important features in Chinese opera, first of all, is of course singing, dialogue, and music. You've got to learn that. You've got to know about music. You've got to be able to speak very clearly. Your diction must be good, and you've got to have a good voice for singing. That's the first most important. Secondly, the gestures and movements. Chinese opera has a lot of mime actions. The gestures and movements, the use of water sleeves, the costume with the long sleeves, how to manipulate the sleeves, because the water sleeves can help the actor to express his emotion. Then thirdly, the use of props like a horse whip, and fourthly, acrobatic stunts if you can do it, and stage fighting. A very graceful way of doing Chinese Kung Fu. It has to be very graceful in opera. It's not like the Jackie Chan type of Kung Fu. It has to be made graceful. So these are the elements that an actor has to learn. And of course, voice is most important. If you don't have a good voice, if you cannot sing properly, then you cannot play the important roles. You can only play very, very minor roles or non-speaking roles like guards and soldiers and servants and things like that.
What kind of philosophy and expectations can young people expect if they were to choose to follow your path and they want to become proteges of their masters? And is there any diet restrictions as well for those who are going to use their voice to project their acts? Because I'm sure I was told that you can't have too much spice for your voice. Is that true?
Well, it depends on individuals. I know of an actress in Hong Kong who takes a lot of chili, and it's so hot, so spicy that I can't even take it, and yet she can, and she still has a beautiful voice. So it depends a lot on individuals, but definitely you need to restrict yourself on the diet in a way. Like for example, for me, I cannot take deep fried things without affecting the voice. So usually 3 days before the performance, I would stay away from deep fried. But I can take spicy and chili things right up to the last moment. So it all depends a lot on the individual, and you know that if you take certain food, it will affect your voice, then you just stay away from it before the performance. But what is most important is to rest your voice, rest your vocal cords. And I noticed, in fact, originally I wanted to be a teacher. When I started at my university career, I wanted to be a teacher. But I discovered that when I had to teach, I used my voice a lot. I had to speak very loudly in the class, and that affected my singing voice. And then I definitely decided that I didn't want to be a teacher, because it would mean, it would affect the singing. So using the voice, over-exercising your vocal cords is not too good for the voice. And also, if you want to learn to be a Chinese opera artist, first of all, you have to have the interest. You must be really interested in it, because you have to spend time to learn the art. And also, if you have a performance, you have to practice and ensure that you can memorize the lines, you can learn all the movements and make sure that your performance is good. So the interest is important. I won't say passion. If you have the passion for it, it's even much better. But as long as you are interested, very interested, you will spend your time, you will use your energy to learn the art and try to perfect it.
What's your secret in memorizing your scripts?
Again, it depends on individuals. When I was young, I had a photographic memory, and I could learn my lines very quickly. And now I'm 74. I find it a little bit more difficult. As you grow older, you cannot memorize things so easily. And also the other thing was when I had a very busy working life, I had so many things in my mind, so many things in my head. So it was not easy just to simply memorize the lines. When I was young, that was very easy. I did not have so many things to think about, to remember, so easy. But to memorize the lines, especially in opera, is easy because it's singing. It's like a song, there is a tune. So it's much easier to memorize the singing, much easier than memorizing the dialogue. And of course, there's a knack in memorizing. There's a sequence. If you follow the sequence properly, when you want to say something, I have to say this first, and followed by this, right? Then you can memorize those lines. That's the sequence is that way.
What advice would you give for those who are going to be pursuing life in your footsteps? Are there any lessons that you've learned as an opera enthusiast after all these years?
Well, as I said, you have to have the interest, the great love for it, the passion for it, willing to sacrifice your time, and of course, in Singapore, willing to sacrifice a bit of money, because to learn the art, you've got to learn, you've got to pay. To practice your singing, you've got to pay the musicians to practice your singing. So you've got to be willing to spend time and a bit of money on it, and also you must be aware that what you are doing, sometimes you may be greatly disappointed, you must be able to withstand some problems that come your way, be strong enough to overcome problems.
Well, once again, Mrs. Joanna Wong, thank you for joining us here at the National
Thank you
Critics'
very
Choice.
much.
And for those who are wondering, if you will get more information, you can actually get hold of her book, Joanna Wong's new book that's now released on Amazon.com and also at Barnes & Noble, or you can even ask your nearest bookstore and place an order. And once again, Robin Stienberg, thank you for joining me in Understanding Chinese Opera in Singapore. Hi, this is Joanna Wong. Please tell us more about your experience traveling as an opera artist overseas. How do the audience look upon Singapore opera when they first saw it? What is it like?
Well, performing overseas is really very satisfying. I had many experiences. My very first experience was in Pasadena in LA when I was on the Singapore float. It was the Rose Parade with all the floats, and I was all dressed in Chinese opera costume, and the float went along the streets in Pasadena, in California, and the people seated along the streets, they waved at us and they say, "Oh, Singapore, we love you, Singapore." And at that time I felt so proud. My goodness, in America, a lot of people know about Singapore and say, "Singapore, we love you, Singapore." It really made me feel very patriotic. Then other performances like in Berlin, after the performance, we had the curtain call, and the audience just stayed on and applaud continuously for more than 15 minutes, refusing to get off their seats. And finally, we had to walk down the stage and started shaking their hands. And even after that, they stayed on to ask questions. That was really so satisfying. When we performed in Singapore in those days, we didn't get such applause like we got overseas. And when we were in Brazil, there were 3,000 people watching an open-air performance that we did, and they just stayed on and clapped and applauded. The applause went on and on. It was really very satisfying. And you had the audience coming up to you after the show, telling you how much they appreciated the show. And they said, some of them, like those in Berlin, they said that they had watched Chinese opera before, Beijing opera, and they didn't understand as much because there were no subtitles. So they didn't know what was happening on the stage. But when we performed in Berlin, we had German subtitles. And they came forward and they said, it's the first time that we watched Chinese opera that we knew what was going on because the subtitles explained things so clearly. And they were really very happy. And wherever we perform overseas, the audience seemed to be even more enthusiastic than the audience in Singapore. And I give you one example in Singapore that was very disheartening. You know the Peranakan place in Orchard Road? One year they had a beer garden, and they invited us to perform open air in the beer garden. And my students performed, and I sat there to watch. And there was a group of youngsters making a lot of noise drinking. And there was this tourist, I think he was a tourist, a Caucasian, came up to the group of youngsters and told them, you should be ashamed of yourself. Your Chinese art is being performed on the stage here, and you're making so much noise, you're disturbing us, we want to watch. We're so interested in your traditional art. So sheepishly, the whole group left the place. So it's so disheartening to see that our own local people don't appreciate as much as the foreigners. And so when we performed overseas, the enthusiasm shown by the audience was really fantastic. It's very heartwarming, and you feel so happy to perform before them.
Would you ever do it again?
Oh yes, yes, I love performing overseas. You know, when we were in Ireland, we got the same type of enthusiasm. Brazil the same, Romania the same. In fact, in Romania, I was very touched by one journalist. We performed the opera 2 nights, and after the show, he came forward to me and said, I watched both nights. So I said, well, having watched the first night, you came back again the second night? He said, yes. The first night, I only watched the subtitles to get the whole story. The second night, I watched the performance without looking at the subtitles, and I enjoyed it very much. So you see the enthusiasm that the foreigners give to our art, you know, and you get really, very heartwarming, very happy, very satisfying feeling.
So how many countries have you been before?
Oh, countless. I've been to so many, I think more than 26 countries. North, south, east, west.
What are the do and don'ts in opera? Could you tell us a little bit more? The do and don'ts in being in an opera career.
Well, first you've got to learn the art properly from good teachers. You've got to practice. Constant practice is important, because once you lack practice, your singing voice isn't so good, your movements will not be so good. That's very important. And you have to try to perform as much as possible.
Are there questions that people shouldn't ask an opera singer?
I don't think so. I think they should be able to ask anything.
Well, once again, Ms. Joanna Wong, thank you for joining us here at the National Critics' Choice.
Thank you very much.